Welcome. Welcome to the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge's first ever virtual Friends Gathering. This afternoon's presentation is the Travels and Traditions of Sandhill Cranes with Dr. Gary Ivey. This is just one of many programs that are taking place this week online during our virtual Friends Gathering. I'll tell you more about what we have left in the next couple days at the end of this program. So who am I? I'm Janelle Wicks. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Malheur, and our mission is to promote the appreciation and conservation of cultural and natural resources on Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. We accomplish that through advocacy, stewardship, and outreach. And these presentations, which would normally happen in the spring during a Friends Members Weekend, have gone virtual in an effort to connect our friends and followers with the refuge from wherever you may be. So welcome. I'm very grateful for your attendance and your support. Our presenter this afternoon is Gary Ivey. Gary Ivey has his BS in Wildlife Management from Humboldt State, along with his MS and PhD in Wildlife Sciences from Oregon State University. Gary was once a biologist at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge and today serves as the board president for the Friends of Malheur. Gary works with the International Crane Foundation and will update you on sandhill crane populations that breed and stage at Malheur Refuge and the Harney Basin, along with the Pacific Flyway. You'll learn about their history, biology, and migration routes, along with wintering and breeding areas of the 3 subspecies that exist in the Flyway. Before I turn things over to Gary, I want to remind everyone again to please keep yourselves on mute. This will mitigate any background noise that could disrupt Gary's audio and the recording. So with that, make sure you have your chat box open. Go ahead and as the presentation is happening, feel free to make comments and post questions in the chat box. I will moderate as we go along, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So with that, Gary, it's all you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can everyone hear me okay?
You can let us know in the chat box how the audio is. Well, no complaints. Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Mike.
I guess I need to.
All right. Thanks, Reggie.
Bear with me here. I'm not sure what's going on. There we go. And before I get going, I saw Eldon McClary out there, and Eldon was a biologist at Malheur in the 60s. I know he was there at least in 1968. He lives in the Midwest. And it's good to see you, Eldon. We've never met face to face, but good to see your face out there. So I'm going to talk about sandhill cranes. I mostly work on cranes here in the West. Oops. I have several hats. I'm the president of the Friends of Malheur Refuge. I'm also the president of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And I'm going to do 2 things at once. And I work as a research associate with the International Crane Foundation. They don't pay me, but I've had to find my own grants and funding sources for that. But anyway, there's 3 great nonprofits, and I hope you can support all of those at some time in your life. So I'm going to talk about cranes. If I can get my keyboard to work. It's not advancing. Janelle, maybe I've got your version open. Can you advance that for me? This worked really smooth last time.
To advance your presentation, but would you like me to share your presentation from
Well,
here?
hang on a second. I think I may have shared yours instead of mine.
Oh, okay.
Because it was in the, I'm not sure how to get out of this. It says I'm screen sharing, but the controls aren't working.
Maybe done right.
Stop it and start over. Sorry about this. There we go. Okay. So there are 15 living species of cranes around the world, and of those, 11 of those are seriously threatened with extinction. That's what the International Crane Foundation focuses on, is those endangered cranes. And probably most of you have heard about the work they do with the crane restoration. They've got that migrant flock that they've established mostly in Wisconsin, there in the Midwest, and which seems to be doing well. It's not growing as fast as they'd like, but I think it's doing pretty good for a young population of cranes. They work closely with the state of Louisiana on their resident crane breeding program down there, non-migratory flock. And they work very closely with the wild population. We have a staff person, Elizabeth Smith, that works on cranes in Texas on the natural population. So they do a lot of good work. I'm going to talk about the most abundant crane species in the world. On the Platte River, the year before last, they counted 900,000 some sandhills at their peak count on the Platte. And if you want to see lots of cranes, go to the Platte River in March. There's a Audubon Sanctuary, the Rose Sanctuary, where you can rip blinds and see tens of thousands of cranes fly into the river at night or leave the roost in the morning. It's fantastic viewing down there. So anyway, I'm going to focus on the birds in the West. And I spent 15 years of my life working on cranes at Malheur with an old biologist there, Carol Littlefield, who started studying cranes in the 60s at Malheur. He passed away last year, unfortunately, but he did a lot of great work, and I've kind of built on his legacy over the years. I keep getting these controls popping up, Janelle, which seem to be interfering with my buttons. Sorry about that. It's not advancing again. There we go. Okay. I began working on cranes actually in 1979. I became a craniac when I worked on a duck nesting study at Malheur, looking at land use effects on duck nest densities there. And I had about 8 pairs of cranes on my study plots. And I got to know Carol Littlefield. We were marking cranes. He was marking cranes for several years there. Eldon probably helped catch some of those birds. And we tracked those birds. And over the years, I became assistant biologist there in 1983 and the supervisory biologist in 1990. So I worked 15 years in refuge, and cranes were a big focus of our monitoring and research there. After I left the refuge, in 1999 and 2000, I conducted surveys of nesting cranes distribution in Oregon and California. 2001, I conducted a satellite telemetry, a very small sample of 6 birds along the lower Columbia River, Sauvie Island, Wildlife Area, and Ridgefield near Portland, Vancouver. 2002, I co-authored the Washington State Recovery Plan for Sandhill cranes, where they're listed as threatened in the state of Washington. Carol Littlefield was the primary author on that. In 2003, I also studied cranes for Nature Conservancy's property in the Delta in California that they bought. It was a big corporate farm that has a lot of sandhill cranes. 2006, I was a senior author on the Intermountain West Waterbird Conservation Plan, which has a whole bunch of sandhill crane conservation strategies summarized in there. 2008, I finished my master's on nesting ecology. My studies of cranes at Malheur Refuge was my master's. 2011, I put together a little booklet about managing cranes on private lands in the Intermountain West. 2012, I consulted with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which is about the big Twin Tunnel water diversion project and its effects on a lot of wildlife. While I was working on my PhD during those years. 2013, I mapped the winter distribution with some partners all over California to understand better the wintering landscape they use. In 2015, I defended my PhD where I studied wintering ecology of greater and lesser sandhill cranes in the Delta region of California. So I've been working on cranes, but I also work on swans and other water birds. Little history. Cranes were a very popular species for people to eat as we settled North America, and populations were depleted. The whooping cranes were down to 15 birds at the low, mostly because of hunting and subsistence hunting by settlers, market hunting to some degree. Sandhill cranes were market hunting extensively in their wintering grounds in California. And this history is just kind of looking at the western flocks of greater sandhill cranes, which nest in the Intermountain West and a little bit in Washington State, basically the Cascades, the Sierras, and the Rockies here in the West. And there are other populations, I'll talk about those later. But in 1940, well, first of all, from 1890 to 1918, they're drastically reduced. I forgot to mention in the mid-1800s, there were some railroad surveys that were conducted to find the best railroad routes to get to California and the West Coast. And on those surveys, they had these biologists and botanists and geologists on those teams, and they documented all the flora and fauna. And those folks reported that they regularly encountered sandhill cranes throughout the Intermountain West. They were fairly common, and they even reported that some of the Indian villages had pet cranes. So anyway, they're fairly common, and they were drastically reduced. By the 1940s, only about 5 pairs remained in California, according to Mr. Walkinshaw. The Birds of Oregon says there were about 100 in the 1940s. Wilson and Jewett Birds of Oregon, about 100 pairs survived in Oregon in the 40s. They went extinct in Washington State as a breeder in 1941. The last one was on Signal Peak on the Yakima Reservation in 1941, the last nest. And because of that, they ended up with state endangered status in Washington, and California declared them a threatened species when they did their state listed species legislation in the 1980s. But they've recovered significantly. They were protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918, but they were classified as a game species, and they are hunted in about 15 states now. They were classified as a game species, but the seasons on all cranes were closed. Even whooping crane is considered a game species if its population ever gets high enough that the Fish and Wildlife Service considers them healthy enough to harvest and delisted, of course. They may become part of the hunting program, but sandhill cranes in the 60s increased in numbers enough, especially in the Central Flyway, the birds that stage in Nebraska and the Flat, that hunting seasons started opening in the Central Flyway, and eventually that hunting spread to Alaska, and now several states in the Eastern Flyway. But populations increased because of this protection, but also because they learned to forage in grain fields. Historically, they probably mostly fed in wetlands. I think in California, they probably ate a lot of acorns, as the common cranes do in Spain. Still, there were huge valley oaks in California before settlement, and most of those oaks are gone. Probably 99.9% of the valley oak areas are gone in California. But their ability to shift to corn and rice and other grains, I think, has really helped their populations grow. There still are threats. Populations are doing fairly well across their range. There are some groups that are not doing as well as others, but urbanization and development, increasing human footprint is really causing issues, especially on the wintering grounds in the West here in California. They're losing roughly about 10% of their habitat in their traditional wintering sites every year due to crop changes. There's a lot of conversions to orchards and vineyards because the demand for wine and nuts has been increasing in recent years. And urbanization is still expanding as well. Climate change is a big threat. We're losing wetlands in some areas. Here in the Intermountain West, droughts are becoming more frequent, generally drier climates. So the water they need for their chicks to survive is disappearing. And so generally production's been not as good as it was 30 years ago. This is my crayon version of crane distribution. We have 3 migratory subspecies and 3 non-migratory subspecies of sandhill cranes that have been recognized. And I'll start with the non-migratory birds real quick. There's about 200 or 300 Cuban sandhill cranes on the Isle of Cuba that don't migrate. We don't know a lot about them, but I see it now that we've got better relations with Cuba's scheming on a strategy to help start working on the Cuban sandhills. There's a Florida sandhill crane. If you've been in Florida, you may have seen those. They don't migrate. They're state threatened, listed as threatened by the state, and that population seems to be declining, and a lot of issues with urbanization and just human stresses. This little yellow circle is the Mississippi sandhill crane. There's about 300 of the Mississippi sandhill cranes, and they're supplementing that flock with birds that are released from various zoos. And for years, I think the Ducks and Wildlife Center was raising Mississippi sandhill cranes. I'm not sure if they still are, but anyway, those are the three non-migratory flocks. And you may not know this, but historically there was a non-migratory whooping crane flock in Louisiana, and that country, the last nesting whooping crane down there was in the early 50s, and they last disappeared, and that's why Louisiana is trying to reestablish this non-migratory flock. But getting to the migrant subspecies, I'll talk more about these. But generally, the lesser, the smallest of the subspecies nests further north, and this red area here in the Arctic is where most of the lessers are nesting, and also the Aleutian Islands, the Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet area, Bristol Bay, part of Alaska. These tend to be the Pacific Flyway birds, and these birds here are mid-continent birds, which means they go through the Platte River, primarily the lessers. This intermediate group, which I'll talk more about, is the Canadian sandhill crane. They're mostly in the boreal forest zones of Canada and along the coast of western coast of British Columbia and Alaska, south of the Copper River Delta. And then we've got graders, which are mostly, there's several different groups that are classified. I'm pretty sure these aren't graders here, but I'm going to redo this slide. But there's apparently some graders up in interior British Columbia, around Caribou, Socoton region. There's some around Kamloops. And this is the distribution here in Oregon, California, roughly. These are the Central Valley population of greater sandhill cranes, which are named for the wintering areas. They winter in the Central Valley of California, from Chico down to almost Bakersfield, basically in the valley. But I'll talk more about their distribution in the valley later. But we also have a smaller group of graders called the Lower Colorado River population, which seems to be mixing with these other two flocks, but they mostly winter around Salton Sea, the Colorado River, Colorado Indian Reservation in this region down here. And then the greater Yellowstone area, we have the Rocky Mountain population, which are birds that go to Bosque del Apache Refuge in New Mexico, a wonderful place to see cranes in the winter. They've got a big festival of cranes in November and December that you might want to take advantage of. But some of those graders winter in northern Mexico as well. We've got a little group called the prairie population, which is part of this mid-continent group that goes down the Central Flyway. And they're not doing great, not studied very well. But then we also have the eastern population, which is growing exponentially in recent years. And they're in the Midwestern states around the Great Lakes. And this probably doesn't do them justice. I think they've extended further east since I put this together. But there's about 70,000 of these. Not sure, about 10,000 maybe of these prairie graders, about 20,000 Rocky Mountain birds, about 3,000 Lower Colorado River, and 8 to 10,000 Central Valley population birds. So those are the graders. How do you tell them apart? It's fairly easy for the lessers and the graders. For your birders out there, you want to know this probably. It's pretty tough to identify these Canadians. This drawing came from the Washington Recovery Plan, which I provided photos for, but these are just scale, so you can see the difference in bill size and head shapes. The graders have a very flat head, and the skull is about 1/3 of this length between the tip of the bill and the back of the head. The lessers, it's about 50-50, so that makes it pretty easy if you get a good look at them. And these Canadians are intermediate and they're in between, which after some practice you might figure that out. But the other thing, from banding all these cranes over the years, there's about 4 inches of bare skin on the leg of greater sandhill cranes between the metatarsal joint and the feathers. So this part of the leg here, only about 2 inches on a lesser. So here's lesser with a rounded skull, flatter head, less rounded, 50-50. So now you're an expert. And if you study the birds in Western Oregon, in the Columbia River, those are Canadian, so you might get a look at those as well. How do these subspecies evolve? Did I hear a question or something? Heard a little noise. Anyway, the theory that actually I should back up and say that genetic studies more recently is basically saying that looking at the genetics, there only appears to be 2 subspecies of sandhill crane, and that 5 of those birds I just mentioned, the non-resident birds and the greater sandhill cranes, are all greater sandhill cranes, and the lessers are a separate form genetically. And theory is that the lessers were separated during the Laurentine ice sheet 20,000 years ago, when the ice covered most of Canada, and the lessers were up here in Alaska and Thuringia, which extended the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. And so the lessers were stuck up here, and the graders were down below here. And then these migratory flocks evolved over time at some level. Little trivia: adult males are called roans and females are mares because somebody thought that sandhill cranes look like horses galloping, and so the chicks are colts. People call these are rarely used, but mostly they're called crane flocks. But they've also been called the sedge of cranes, the siege of cranes, or a herd of cranes. I kind of like siege myself. Cranes are long-lived birds with very high adult survival and low productivity. They usually don't nest until they're at least 4 years old, sometimes much older. Populations grow very slowly, so it's very important to keep the adults alive and going much more than their annual production of chicks. Long-lived birds, we've got at least one bird, a few birds that I think, we had one bird at Malheur that we knew was originally banded in 1969 as an adult, was recaptured and remarked in 1983 and was last seen in 2002, and so assuming that it was a 4-year-old because it was paired when it was banding, it was at least 32 years old. There was a bird at Gray's Lake that was banded as a chick that was seen at 40 years old, and nobody saw it die. So I like to think there's some birds out there in the wild that are older than that. In a zoo, a lesser sandhill crane lived for 69 years. Also in a zoo, a Siberian crane lived for 83 years, and there was a male that was producing fertile eggs at 79. So I think that they have capability to live as long as people generally, but probably very few in the wild live that long. Oh, there's my slide about that. These are Siberian cranes. They mate for life like people, which means they don't really mate for life any more than people do. Some people stay together their whole life and some don't, and typically younger pairs are more likely to switch mates, and once a pair gets established and a female finds a male with a really nice territory, she's likely to stick with him, but they don't mate for life necessarily. Not all of them do, at least. And if they lose a mate, they usually find a new one. That one dies in a year or two. The females depend on the male to have a territory, so they're really into real estate, which I'll talk about more later. But they're very territorial on the nesting grounds. They normally lay 2 eggs. 3 eggs and 4 egg clutches are reported. Most of them that I've actually seen are not true individual crane pair clutches. If you look at these 2-3 egg groups I have in the photo here, there's a lightish greenish egg and 2 light brown eggs here. Here's 2 darker tan eggs and a lighter brown egg. Carol Littlefield figured out that these colors vary by female, and you could use the old Munsell soil color test charts and match up the color number for that green egg there, and you get a number, and every year you see that egg, you get the same female. So these have more than one female laying their eggs in them. Back in 2006, there was a young man, Chad August, working in Ruby Lake National Wildlife Refuge on his master's studying nesting cranes, and I went down and visited him one day, and he had a 3-egg nest, and I mentioned that to him. I think most of those 3-egg nests is a dump nest where the bird came in and laid her egg, and anyway, went out, he checked the nest, and it's this photo here that I have of that nest. And the cranes, when they flush, the female flushed off the nest, they usually do kind of a killdeer act, not quite as dramatic, but they'll drag their wing and try to distract you. And anyway, I was taking photos, and Chad was writing down his data, and I looked across the pond there, and there were 3 cranes strutting together. And I said, Chad, I think this male has 2 wives. And he says, that's interesting, because last year when they banded the chick at that pair, there were 3 birds, 3 adults. So I think that crane did have 2 wives. One of my colleagues at ICF studied genetics of the local nesting flock around Baraboo, Wisconsin, and found that 15% of the eggs were fertilized by the neighboring male. So they're not as, they don't have strong as fidelity as we would think. Generally, brood survival is very low with cranes because they're on the ground for about 90 days and they can't fly, and they depend on their parents to defend from predators, and almost every predator out there consumes crane chicks. I had harriers kill some chicks in a study I did. Coyotes take a lot of chicks. Mink are very tough on crane chicks. Great horned owls, raccoons. So it's pretty tough to raise chicks. They have a lot of interesting behaviors. I took this photo on the flat, a couple of birds doing a little dance up here there. And if you really want to get into that, you can get this little crane dictionary most nature stores. Or you can find it on eBay, but they're not very expensive. But it'll help explain what you're seeing. One of my favorite behaviors is this. These birds are going to fly in about 30 seconds when they start doing this. So if you see a flock of cranes doing the let's fly lean, you can tell your friends, you can bet your friends that they're going to fly, and you're probably going to bet just about every time. What color are cranes? They're these big silver gray birds, and we've got these brown birds. This is a juvenile, and this is a juvenile. You can tell they're juveniles because they've got this rusty nape. They don't have much of a crown. This one's starting to get a little bit of a crown, but this is a juvenile. You can see some kind of very faint tan feathers here. This one's a younger juvenile. And this is a lesser, and this is a greater here. Again, 1/3, 2/3, and 50-50. So why is this guy red? Is that the normal color? What color have you seen the cranes? These are lessers. I took this, or one of my colleagues took this photo up at Homer, Alaska. And look how bright these are. What's going on here? Cranes love to paint themselves with mud in the spring and breeding season. They stain their feathers, and depending on how much iron's in the local soils, the color of the crane depends on the soil type a little bit. And so they do that. And why do they do that? There's different theories about that. One is that they look prettier to their mate. Probably the main theory is they're more camouflaged for sitting on the nest, and the male does spend about 20% of the incubation time while the female's off feeding, taking care of the eggs, and sitting on the nest. But another theory is it maybe helps with mites. I think that they like to look pretty. They kind of like that a little bit, but we don't really know. The old name for lesser Sandhill cranes is little brown cranes, and they started calling them lessers in the 60s or so, but the old name for the graders was the Mexican crane. I always wondered why they called them little brown cranes, and when I started working in California wintering grounds, I figured that out pretty quick. If you look at this photo, these little brown cranes are lessers, and these big silver cranes you see scattered out here are graders. So what's going on here, apparently because at least some of the birds we marked up in Alaska around Homer, they've got about a 2,500-mile migration, and they save their energy for that molt, that body molt, because they want to save that energy for migration. So they start molting after they get to the wintering grounds. The graders, yes, 50 to maybe 500 miles away. They have much shorter migration, so they go ahead and molt before they migrate. And that's why they're different colors. But at times, graders are very red during the nesting season, even if they're only silver. By the end of the winter, most of the lessers are pretty silver as well. And there's also other exceptions. Here's a couple of leucistic lessers that were near Burns, near north of Malheur, back in 2013. These are leucistic, which they're not true albinos. They don't have pink eyes. They've got gray legs. So this, for people would think, is melanistic, which is dark pigment, excessive melanin in the feathers. And I've heard, contrary to that Jim Lewis, who did his PhD on wintering cranes in Texas back in the 60s, found that a lot of these dark birds were infected with this fungus that attacks their feather follicles and causes dark pigmentation. So the jury's still out on that for me, but there are dark birds out there. They're pretty rare. There's another leucistic crane from Malheur Refuge. This bird's was seen again this last year. This is from about 8 years ago, but that bird's around somewhere in California, apparently, because it was also seen at Ash Creek Wildlife Area. And these guys are flying with, what's this one? It's not a grader. Let's see the 50-50 here. No, this isn't a great shot for that, but obviously a lesser flying with them. So now that you know the subspecies, which ones are these? What do you see? Do you see a 50-50 or a 2/3, 1/3 skull? Do you see a chick on the far right? So how do you sex the cranes? Well, the plumage is identical. And you can't really tell by the plumage, but by their behavior and by their size, generally, the females are usually 4 or 5 inches shorter than their mate. As you see in this shot, here's a female. Also, when they do their unison call, which is a territorial display that they do, the male goes all the way back up to almost straight in the air, and the female only gets to about a 45. So we got the male here on the right and the female on the left doing the unison call. So you see them do that, that's a clue. This is a little video, if I can get it to play, Dan Streifer took in Burns a few years ago. This manure pile, which cranes really love in this old feedlot. And they're doing a unison call. These birds, there's 5 birds here. So watch which ones have their heads straight up and which ones are up. Are we ready? I'm going to play this twice. You can also see the 2 in the middle are a little bigger. But watch again, those 2 in the middle are the males. And what I find very interesting about this is that, this bird on the left seems to have 2 wives as well. Why are 2 adult females hanging out unison calling with this one guy? So maybe we have more cranes with multiple wives. It's interesting. They're really into real estate, and the average crane territory at Malheur Refuge, which has a lot of cranes, is about 20 acres according to Carol Littlefield's studies. But it depends on the landscape and the habitat. They need a lot of wetland habitat because they need to feed their chicks a lot of food. They're not shy about eating mice and voles, particularly voles. They evolved to be just the right height to look into red-winged blackbird nests, and so you see the black. That's one way to find cranes during the nesting season is watch for blackbirds diving at the cranes because they're trying to chase them away from their territories, but they'll eat the chicks and the eggs. They'll feed them to their own chicks. And I watched a crane kill a young pheasant that was almost the size of a quail and feed that to one of his almost full-size chicks. And they're pretty vicious predators. They need a lot of food, though. I'm going to talk about some of the work on greater Sandhill cranes. Again, they're tall, majestic, big bill, and cool birds. Their distribution in Oregon, someone mentioned they're in Bend, and they see the birds in the Cascades, and those are all graders. They're breeding in Oregon, as far as we know. There's a few birds up around Mount Hood, but the big, I'm not in Oregon. In Oregon, there's a few birds here in the Cascades, and the big 3 counties where most of the cranes are. Harney County is number 1, and Lake and Klamath County are 2 and 3. But there are birds up in northeast Oregon and along the spine of the Cascades. Just across the river is Convoy Lake National Wildlife Refuge, and there's about 35 pairs up there in Washington as well. Ladd Marsh is up in this area, and it's a state wildlife area. Kathy Nowak, one of my colleagues, has been studying cranes there with satellite telemetry, and she actually found that birds at Ladd Marsh, most of the birds they marked go to the Central Valley. 2 of the birds they marked go to the Lower Colorado River, so that other population is kind of joined as they've recovered and joined with the Northeast Oregon and overlap, but they go with the family traditions of where they actually spend the winter. Malheur in 1999 had 245 pairs doing surveys. That's Steens Mountain in the background. If you haven't visited Malheur, you should go. And Convoy Lake Refuge, another beautiful place with a lot of nice meadows, has about 35 pairs. Their nest sites are typically in emergent marsh habitat. The bottom right here is a Broadfruit brewery, that other one's in Cattail. But they usually build a floating platform, and it's pretty necessary to prevent nest losses from floods. And I had one nest that I followed up on that when the chicks hatched, the water was up to my chin. The nest floated and they hatched at least. Brood survival is very low. I kind of would have talked about that. So, the next study I want to talk about is that we did a little study in Homer, Alaska back in 2008, and I started my PhD that in 2007 working on the wintering grounds in California. We had a quota of, we wanted to catch 25 graders and at least 45 lessers, and we were a little shy after that first winter on our grader sample, and I got this call from Ed Bailey, who's an old biologist that was retired, and I worked for the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuges, and he had some money and he wanted to study the cranes that came to his property there and around Homer. And I told him at the time I didn't have time to deal with it, but because we needed a bigger sample of lessers, I finally agreed kind of at the last minute. So we ended up getting our satellite radios about 5 days before we left on our trip to Homer. And I should mention, Catching That Crane Watch is the group that Ed founded with his partner Nina Frost, Oregon State University, USGS were partners in the PhD study, and this is part of it. But we went to Homer, Alaska, and we kind of booked, because we were in the tourist season was well away before we got going, and we booked about, for a 2-week period, we had about 8 different cabins that we had booked to stay in because people didn't have that much vacancy. We couldn't stay in the same place, and we had no clue how we were going to catch 10 cranes. Originally, Ed wanted to do 20, and I agreed to try to catch 10. I thought that maybe we'd have to chase down pairs with chicks and ban the chicks that couldn't fly. But it wasn't. But one technique we had. Usually we catch most of our cranes with rocket nets, and I'll show you a quick shot of the rocket net capture. But the other technique is called a noose line with snares, and we couldn't take rocket nets on the airplane to Alaska because it involves explosives and lots of permits and paperwork, which we couldn't get pulled off. But we used our noose lines. So we got to Homer, and we weren't sure where we were going to find the cranes, what we were getting into. My partner, Carolyn Herziger, was helping me. The first cabin, Glacier View Cabins, we found the cranes on the lawn. And this became kind of an interesting thing. The people next door to Glacier View Cabins were feeding cranes on their mound, and they were feeding them there at the cabins. We ended up catching 12 cranes in 11 days with my snares, and 8 of those birds were caught here at this site. This bird on the left up here is a female, which we caught in California. So we're happy to see her up here at Homer, Charlie 3, C003. And I call this guy Big Red because he's got a chick. They've got a chick for 5 years. They raised chicks and brought them to the Delta. And Big Red wouldn't let any of these other cranes get anywhere near our snares. You may not be able to see this, but there's a little line of snares right here. This bird steps right over. But anyway, we ended up catching cranes there that day eventually after Big Red left. These are what the noose lines look like. They're a bunch of 100-pound test monofilament line tied to stakes that are on these pegs that go in the ground. And when the bird gets his foot in there, it cinches down on the foot. And there's not a lot of tension on the leg when they try to escape because it pulls these pegs out one at a time and releases the tension. It's a pretty safe trapping method. I just wanted to show this rocket net shot. I did a little project helping Fish and Wildlife Service and some other partners from Texas University, I think it was Texas Tech, that were studying this Lower Colorado River population down by Salton Sea National Wildlife Refuge, which is the Sunny Bono Salton Sea National Wildlife Refuge. This is a it's not a feedlot, it's a grain shipping facility where they, when the grain gets old, sitting in their warehouses, they dump this extra grain out here in this open yard, and there's a duck club about a mile away where these cranes roost, and they feed on that waste grain, which is pretty ugly, moldy. But anyway, we set up our rocket net there, and I got a quick shot here of the rocket net. No cranes were injured in this shot. Oops, it didn't work. I'm going to go back. There we go. Are you ready? We caught 11 birds in that shot. Play it one more time. We caught cranes in Homer because cranes are very human-oriented to Homer, and it's partly because it was a. If you've ever been to Homer, they've got the Homer Spit, where they've got the commercial fish canneries processing stuff out there, and you can take on a charter boat, or you can go out and go fishing with commercial fishermen. Anyway, there used to be a lady called the Eagle Lady. I forget what her first name was, but she used to feed eagles all the fish waste. And they built up this huge population of bald eagles around Homer, which are a big threat to the lesser sandhill cranes. They kill cranes, they kill people's cats and dogs and poodles, and chickens and ducks. And cranes have learned if they hang around people's houses, they're less harassed by the eagles. So they've got this kind of it's the worst of two evils: be around people or be more vulnerable to eagles. And they know the neighborhoods and the houses they can trust and who has bad dogs. They kind of figure out who's feeding the cranes, and so we caught 3 of our cranes at this property. But if you drive around Homer in May or June, it's just you see cranes standing in people's lawns all over town, around the outskirts of town. So we marked 10 birds with satellite radios, and this is the results. They were marked up here around Homer. They flew up to the north end of the Kenai Peninsula, went through. Just forgot the name of the pass there. Took my time. But anyway, they flew through this pass near Seward, and they go down, pretty much hug the coast of Alaska until they get right just about to the BC. The southern tip of Alaska is about right here, and there's a couple of river corridors that go up into the interior in this area that they follow, and they turn in the interior of British Columbia, come down through eastern Oregon. A lot of them stopped at Othello, Washington, where Columbia National Wildlife Refuge has a bunch of grain, mostly corn plots for cranes. And they kind of spread out through Oregon. Some of them stopped at around Burns and at Malheur Refuge in the Double O. And then they kind of funnel down and mostly winter in the Delta, this is just south of Sacramento, the Modesto area, San Joaquin River National Wildlife Refuge, and the Merced grasslands. None of the birds we marked went down to Pixley, but there are quite a few lessers that do use Pixley, which is a little further down by, it's north of Bakersfield, about 50 miles. But anyway, so that's basically their migration route. That's the Pacific Flyway population of the lessers. So the Canadian sandhills, which I've already hinted at a little bit, we studied, we had funding for 6 satellite radios in 2001. And this is a nice male Canadian, and look how dark he is. He's got some nice mud in his area from southern Alaska, taken by Craig Flatten. This is a pair of, I won't go into the details of the story, but there's a tame pair and a tame group of birds that are from that original tame pair around Rifle Migratory Bird Sanctuary near Delta, BC, which is south of Vancouver, BC. These are Canadians. If you want to get close and personal with them in the fall, winter, you can eat out of your hand. Be careful, don't get your eyes too close. But so we were asked to do this study, and originally it was going to be a study of the lessers that everybody talked about that were at Richfield and Sauvie Island there, just around Portland, Vancouver. And we started catching birds with our snares, and the first 2 birds we caught were Canadians, and so I decided, well, we want to catch some lessers. Maybe they all left early, and so we'll come back. And so we came back in February, and ended up in February and April we caught 4 more, and they were all Canadians by measurement. And I spent a lot of time looking and hunting and searching. I never saw a lesser there. I never saw a greater there. Other people report graders and lessers. I think there's a chance there's a small number of lessers that probably join this flocks, but these seem to be mostly Canadians, which are the intermediate. The results of that, 6 birds, if you look at the very north end, the bird in red, that's where he spent the summer. The orange bird was here, the blue bird was up here, so 3 of them in southern Alaska. The yellow one was here, and green made it to here, but we got miss. Anyway, you get the idea. Oh, red was here, so that's the distribution of these birds. And in the fall, unfortunately, 4 of our radios failed, so we only had 2 active radios in the fall of the satellite transmitters, and one of those birds spent the winter in the Lower Columbia River, the red one, which about a third of that flock apparently spends the winter there, and the other 2/3 apparently go down to California. And So this bird, they fly through the Willamette Valley. So if you live on the west side and hear cranes migrating, it's usually in early November, I think, that they come through there. This bird stopped at both Lower Klamath Refuge and Butte Valley Wildlife Area down here in California before spending the winter mostly between Chico and Marysville in the rice country. And in 2008, I helped some Canadian biologists mark a bird up in Vancouver, British Columbia, which pretty much did the same thing as this bird, except in the spring, it went through eastern Oregon and eastern Washington before it went back. One other project I did, after I got interested in these birds, these are my two records here, I think. I got some data from the Forest Service, the Tongass National Forest, about locations that are known breeding areas in Alaska. And, I got the Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist Bruce Conant volunteered to fly me. I got a free flight to go look at these sites, crane habitat. So we spent 2 days surveying southern Alaska coast and BC and looking at areas where we had crane data from my telemetry study. And so these are some of the photos of that habitat, which I think is pretty bizarre from what I've been experiencing. They nest in these bogs. They're big sphagnum type bogs, and this is saltwater. There's these estuaries. There's a bird on one of the mounds in one of the bogs. One of my colleagues, Krista Rosen, did her master's studying the nesting ecology of these birds. They're around Bella Bella Shearwater on the central BC coast, and kind of there, but we documented that they're up in this dense forest, nesting in these bogs, and they follow these deer trails down to the beach and the coast, and they're feeding their chicks in this intertidal zone and this grassy freshwater zone, probably eating a lot of crustaceans in the saltwater environment, and pretty interesting to me. The last thing, I'm probably running low on time here, but I'm going to talk about my PhD, which focuses on the conservation issues around the Delta region, but generally the wintering range of the Central Valley population and the Pacific Coast population of graders and lessers, and the issues down there. Historically, cranes used to be common in the Los Angeles Basin and the San Diego area and the whole Lower Colorado River area, and pretty much throughout the Central Valley. And they were also common in the Bay Area, Oakland, Hayward, that country, data and a lot of archaeological sites where they found a lot of crane bones from the natives harvesting cranes there. Now, these green circles kind of represent the wintering sites, so they're not everywhere. And actually, this site is the Grizzle Plains, which is pretty much no longer used by cranes. They've abandoned that. They also abandoned the site a little bit north of here, by Red Bluff, that they used to use because they've lost some of their forage base because of development and changes in habitat. In 2013, we mapped in the winter all these birds all over the valley. These are just block locations, so you can kind of get a real intimate detail of what fields are being used by cranes and have better handle of the distribution, which it really looks like this throughout the valley based on that data, which I think hasn't changed much since then, although we're still losing about 10% of the habitat a year down there. But, cranes are stuck in these spots because they're stuck on their traditional roost sites. They're protected where they aren't hunted, or there is no disturbance from waterfowl hunting. Most of those sites are on refuges. Some of them are on other conservation lands like TNC properties or Audubon sites. But so they have a limited range of where they can go find food, and they have limited energy of how far they can fly. So they need a roost site that's protected and secure, and they need foraging habitat around that roost site within easy flight distance. In my study, cranes were very loyal to their wintering sites, really high fidelity, much more than lessers. Lessers bounce around, but their commuting distance, which is foraging flight distances, was 2.5 times longer for graders and lessers. So for graders, it was about a mile average flight to go find food, and for lessers, about 2.5 miles. And their home range size was 10 times larger for lessers and graders. So that has some implications on managing these subspecies in California. You might remember that the graders are threatened, so there's some impetus to protect their habitat and maintain them in the landscape. So this is some of the strategies we developed looking at that. This is a Delta map in the background, but if we ever roost site. Graders are going to fly, we can expect them to fly out to about 5 kilometers and lessers out to about 10. So if you're going to do conservation to maintain enough food in that landscape, you got to think about this scale. For lessers, you can expand it a little bit. Some other strategies, you might put a new roost site that's within the use area of a grader out here, and all of a sudden they have access to additional habitat out another 5 kilometers. And so those are some of the things that we're recommending for management consideration, conservation. If farmers want to favor use by cranes, they're really focused on grain crops. It's important to reduce tillage or delay it so that the birds feed on the waste grain before it gets buried. Tillage, plowing up the corn, basically takes about 80% of the availability away. Also, shallow, after the grain fields are fed out, if you shallow flood in late winter period, the cranes come back and get all the earthworms and insects larvae that come to the surface. That's a good practice. And for grassland type pasture crops and alfalfa, it's very good to irrigate those in the fall when conditions are dry, because that also brings both mice and voles and insect and earthworms to the surface. For corn stubble, we found that cranes significantly prefer mulched corn, which means they chop up the corn stalks and build a kind of a mulch layer on top of the soil. And the Delta has about 120,000 Aleutian Canada geese and about 50,000 snow geese and a bunch of other waterfowl species out there competing for the waste corn, which is the biggest crop in the Delta. And I think mulching the corn helps give the cranes an advantage over the waterfowl, because cranes are built for digging through stuff, and the geese and ducks aren't very good at that. So it kind of hides the corn from the competitors, but it also, another factor for the mulching, it holds the soil moisture to the surface. It also is good for weed control, because the weeds grow all winter down there in that mild climate. But holding that soil moisture to the surface brings the earthworms to that surface as well, and there's more invertebrate prey becoming available, so that's a good thing. Roost sites should be very shallow, 2 to 4 inches is what they prefer, with minimize human disturbance, and they need to avoid power lines, because power lines are a big threat. We also built this model. This is part of that mitigation strategy for the Delta Twin Tunnel project. But we built this model showing the densities of greater Sandhill cranes and where they could predict to have higher losses from power lines if they're putting in new lines for this tunnel project. But we have to also use that as how do you focus your priorities on where you should provide food and conservation sites. To summarize, though, this is we've got lessers that are nesting up here in Alaska, coming down the coast, back and forth in this range. We have Canadians that are nesting all the way down to Vancouver Island, and a small group around Vancouver, BC, that are just north of the border. We've got graders that are nesting in the interior BC, and all the way down to a little bit south of Lake Tahoe now, and all of them wintering in the Central Valley of California. There's about 50,000 cranes in the Pacific Flyway, and most of those are lesser. About 5,000 Canadians, based on counts that the Nature Conservancy and the state and the Fish and Wildlife Service do on Sauvie Island and Richfield in the fall, or staging early October. They get up to about 5,000 birds, which I think is the population's there then. Generally, they seem to be stable to increasing. Private lands are very important to conserve cranes and maintain them in our lives. So we need to really work with private landowners. I forgot to mention, when we did the breeding ground surveys in Oregon and California, about 65% of the cranes are nesting on private lands. So the private lands around Harney Basin and Burns area are very important to cranes. There were about 80 pairs in the Silvis floodplain when I did the surveys. 245 on Malheur, which is a very high population, but overall, private lands are more important. For the Crane Foundation, please consider supporting us. If you want to contribute towards my Pacific Flyway program, you can go to the donation page and write in Pacific Flyway, because they don't campaign directly for me, but supporting the ICF, the Crane Foundation, is a good thing to do. If you have never seen the Crane Foundation, you should go there. It's in Baraboo, Wisconsin. They've got pairs of cranes of every species on display there, and it's a wonderful place to take your kids, grandkids. So I can ask questions, but it didn't go too long. Here's my email if you want to contact me, and the ICF website. I'll let you get back on, Janelle.
Great, thank you, Gary. Awesome. We do have a few questions. So I'm gonna find those back in the chat box. Claire asked if a female's diet or genetics determine her egg's color.
It seems to be genetics, because I don't know what, I assume they don't eat the same thing every year, but the eggs are the same color every year. So.
Right. Dan Streifer asked, how many nests are in the Harney County area? And I can attest to what Portland Audubon recorded through the crane pair count surveys. In the P Ranch area this year, they found 5 pairs, Territorial, and at least one of those pairs has recently had a colt still observed. And in the Sylvia's floodplain region, through the Project Ivey surveys, there were 5 pairs, and 3 of those pairs still have cranes being observed, or colts.
I would say, to clarify that though, back when we were mapping pairs in the refuge every year, we had a better handle on where to look for them, I think, than they do now. But we had, at the peak, 99, we counted 245 pairs on the refuge and 80 on the Sylvia's floodplain. So, there should be over 300 cranes. But a few years back, the refuge, who's the other Audubon, what's her name? The other Audubon bio that works there for a couple months. Janelle, I can't hear you, you're muted.
I know. Sorry about that. And then there was a question, do cranes near Malheur migrate to Bosque del Apache Refuge?
They do not. The birds that go to Bosque are coming from Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. So, it's a very slim chance that some Malheur birds might go there, but they would have to be birds that originally had this family history of wintering down there that somehow moved over to Malheur, and I doubt that there's any in that situation. But
Right.
When the populations were so small because of overhunting, they became these little pockets of survivors that they went with their traditions of where they survived and spent the winter, and so they developed traditions which they learned from their parents to winter in Central Valley versus Lower Colorado or Bosque, and they teach that. But as the populations expand and they start growing together, they still follow the family traditions. And we had one marked pair that was seen a couple times on the wintering grounds from Malheur pair, that the male and female weren't seen together on the wintering grounds. The female was in the Sacramento Valley and the male was in the Delta, and they're back together on the nesting territory. So she goes where her family went, I think, visits her relatives, and he went where his family went. They're very traditional.
Great. And then the last question we have here in the chat box right now, if anyone else wants to ask a question, go ahead and type it in. But we are going to wrap up. Which populations of sandhill cranes go to the whitewater draw in the winter?
Yes, they're a part of the mid-continent flock, which includes mostly lessers and Canadians. That's the birds that go to Nebraska. Some of those show up into southern Arizona, and a few of the Rocky Mountain population graders go there as well. Most of the graders go to Bosque, but some do use the whitewater draw.
Great.
So.
Well, thanks, Gary. I'm not seeing any more questions. Let me just check one last time. I want to, before we say goodbye, pitch to everyone the last few things that are happening in the next couple days. Tonight, the East Cascade Audubon Society is hosting their first virtual Birders Night, and our Friends volunteer and birder Dan Streifer is going to be giving his presentation, Birding Malheur and Beyond. So I'm really excited about that, and there's still time to register. Tomorrow, you can catch Ken Kaufman giving a basic shorebird ID presentation at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Pacific time. And tomorrow night is Malheur Trivia. So get a couple people together, form a team, sign up. It's going to be a lot of fun. And lastly, you will have heard over the last couple days me saying that the auction was at 7 p.m. and I was misspeaking. It is at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So please register for the auction. We have a lot of really great sponsors that have made donations for auction items. And a couple examples here are these cross-stitched prints that are framed of mallard ducks. They're really beautiful. And this piece of horsehair Dene pottery that was donated by Ord's Museum and Gallery. So just a couple examples of the great items that are going to be available for auction. The rest are, you can see in a video on our Facebook page if you're interested. Now, lastly, we are offering all the programs happening this week have been offered for free, but we do ask that if you see a value or have enjoyed the programs, please consider giving a donation to the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. And I'm going to put the link to that donation page in the chat box. You could always reach out to me through our website or by emailing me at friends@malheurfriends.org. And I'm going to go ahead and put that donation page in the chat box right now. And you can find the rest of the registration links for our programs on our website. Link for everyone. Thank you guys so much. And if you're interested, you can register for more programs at malheurfriends.org and just follow on the main page over to the rest of our virtual programming post. All right, thank you guys so much for attending and supporting the Friends